So right now let's take a look at how to successfully complete this midterm lesson plan part 2. Just like before, you need to open up the template provided by your instructor and make a copy of that. So go to File, Make a Copy, rename it and make sure that it's in your Google Drive. You also need to change the share settings to make sure it says anyone with the link can comment. We want to make sure that anybody with the link can comment. All right. Now what you're going to do is you need to both create things to attach within this document as well as describe how you're going to implement these things. So let's take a look at this. Part 2, assessment plan. It looks like what we're going to work on is this. What evidence pieces or assessments are you going to utilize during your lesson plan to help the teacher and the students know where they are in relation to the learning goals? And so if you need a reminder of like formative and summative assessment, you've got a quick reminder there. But I would study each part of the rubric because it says right here that what we need to do is make sure that as we design our assessment and our rubrics, make sure that all of our learning outcomes have specific appropriate criteria, make sure that our assessment criteria is clearly written, and make sure that you use formative assessments and possible adjustments based on the evidence and data collected. Okay? And a key part of this will also be to make sure that you provide accommodations and modifications to students who require it. Now what you can do is, if you scroll to the bottom, you can find an example or an exemplar of an assessment plan that was completed by a previous student, okay, that shows all of the key elements. So let's take a look here. It says formative assessment. Look closely at your unpacked standard and learning goal. How can you utilize formative assessment to gather evidence of student understanding and skills throughout the lesson in order to adapt and adjust your instruction? So looking at your learning goal, you're going to figure out, after I work with these students for like 10 to 20 minutes, what would be the first quick check that I would do to see where they're at and to decide what are the changes that I need to make to my instruction at that point. Okay? And whatever formative assessment you design, you need to insert a link to it right here. So let's say that I'm getting started on this part and I'm thinking, okay, here's my learning goal. I need to create a really solid formative assessment that checks for understanding. I would create that and then take the link to it and insert that link in my lesson plan. So where it says right here, I could just highlight that and go to Insert, Link, and then insert the link to the formative assessment that I've designed there. Now, an important part of this is to indicate accommodations and or modifications to the assessment based on the student's needs. So just like in part 1, we need to be very, very mindful and aware of our students that are on our watch list. If we're secondary, there's that list of kiddos again. For elementary or early childhood, that's where we're going to be. And remember, if you're special education, you're going to be looking at whatever grade level you anticipate working with, either secondary or elementary. Okay? And when I look through these kids, I'm going to say, okay, well, I've got this young man right here, and it looks like these are his strengths, these are his areas of struggle, and now looking at the areas that he's most likely to struggle in, then I go back and I look at the formative assessment that I've designed. And I'm thinking, well, this young man would probably need some additional support in, maybe it's in the vocabulary aspect or remembering and processing all the different steps that we need to do. Whatever the need is, I will want to look at the needs of each of my students and identify how I can best accommodate them or modify it if necessary in order for each of my students to be able to be as successful as possible on this formative assessment. So if we go back to our example or exemplar right here, we see that on this lesson plan, every single student is accounted for, and the part of the learning task that's most likely to be a struggle for that particular student, we identify and explain how we will accommodate them. Now, we're not expected to be experts in modifications and accommodations for our students just yet, but we do need to be very knowledgeable about how to best meet the needs of our students. That's why, after you look closely at each of your students, you can click on this link and use this site of suggested accommodations and modifications based on the need of your student. So let's say, for example, I have Steve who struggles with social situations. I would go to the site and go to the tab that seems most appropriate to his need. And in this case, we have a tab for social support strategies. Now, based on the student and the task, I identify 1 to 2 strategies that are the best fit to include in my lesson plan. Notice that you not only have testing accommodations, memory difficulties, vocabulary, attention, social support strategies, behavior, you also have more categories based on the needs of kiddos. So if you click here, you can also find strategies for reading comprehension, writing or oral language, written expression, and so on and so on. So in summary, for Part A, you will have a link to the formative assessment that you create, as well as a list of each of your kiddos and how you will help accommodate them to be successful on this task. So the next step is to design success criteria for formative assessment. You need to determine what would your success criteria look like for this formative assessment. In other words, without simply grading it, how can you gauge to what degree your kiddos are getting it and what adjustments you need to make? So at some point you need to address what would you do in the case of, with the exception of a few individuals, most of your students demonstrate they are ready to move on to the next step? What would you do if about 20 to 30% of your students demonstrate that they're not yet ready to move on? And what if about 60% of your students demonstrate they're not yet ready to move on? And the way you determine what you'll do is by developing a qualitative or a quantitative rubric and action plan. So you can click here to see the examples provided by the instructor. And you'll see that your learning goal goes right in here. And you'll either decide, okay, look, there are 2 things I'm going to be teaching my kiddos early on in the lesson. I need to assess their ability to be able to do this correctly. Or instead of just going a certain percentage that they're getting correct, you could try the other format, which is more of a qualitative or descriptive rubric where the student always uses proper procedures when doing it. So you might determine that it's about how many they get correct or to what degree they're able to perform a procedure or a task or something like that. Now remember, if you look at your learning goal and there are 2 separate components that you're actually going to be assessing, you would need 2 different constructs over here. So in this case, I need to see if they're able to multiply fractions and if they're able to do it with mixed numbers. So that's why I have one set up here based on their ability to multiply fractions and another one based on their ability to multiply mixed numbers. Now you'll see that in these columns right here, you have generic suggestions provided by your instructor. A student is ready to move on if he or she is at this point. The student might require some added support here. Student definitely needs some extra support at this level. But you can't just leave this generic as far as student is ready to move on. You'd have to specify ready to move on to what. You can't just leave this as student might require reteaching, clarification, etc. You need to identify which of these strategies would be the most appropriate and talk about what would you do to reteach. What would you reteach? What would you clarify? So again, these are just a guide. You need to make these much more specific to your learning goal. So if we go back and look at this example that's provided, you can see that in Part B, this student has created an assessment criteria, very specific to his or her learning goal. And in this case, it looks like he or she is going with a quantitative scale, but being very specific about what the teacher will do in each of these cases. If the student is ready to move on, might need more clarification, or is definitely in need of some reteaching and clarification. In addition, this teacher also went in and identified what will I do in the case that A, with the exception of a few students, everybody's ready to move on, and responded to what the teacher should do. What should the teacher do if about 20 to 30% is not ready to move on? And what about if 60% or so of your students are not yet ready to move on? So the purpose of this is to help us determine on the front end, how can we tell to what degree our students are struggling, and to identify what will we do to make adjustments to our instruction. Now, the next part of this assignment is the deeper level thinking task or assessment. This would be towards the end of your lesson, more of a summative assessment that works to engage our students in deeper level thinking. So by deeper level thinking, remember, on Webb's depth of knowledge, what we're shooting for in this case is a depth of 3. Our students need to be involved in strategic thinking and or decision making. And this is exhibited through planning, using evidence, and more demanding cognitive reasoning. And the way that you can tell it's usually strategic or decision making is that it often has more than one plausible or possible answer, and it requires students to justify their response. Now, if you'd like to see some examples, you do have a link that says click right here to see some examples. So you can think through, what does higher level thinking really look like? I would encourage you to look at the upper levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And remember, just because kiddos are creating something doesn't make it higher level thinking. We can say, hey, create a poster that shows me the different steps of the water cycle. Just creating a poster could be the same thing as just showing that I understand and can remember something. Creation in this sense actually means to synthesize different viewpoints and ideas into something that's unique and original. That's why I would encourage you to look closely at Webb's depth of knowledge at this description for level 3. And as you go through these examples, if you look at slide 12, you can see some examples of activities that do fall into a depth of 3. On slide 14, you have a link to Karen Hess's matrix of sample tasks in different content areas. So for example, if I'm working with a math lesson, I could click on math. And then I'm looking at not depth of 1, not depth of 2, but depth of 3, and looking at these different tasks that are considered strategic thinking or decision making and reasoning, and figuring out which of these is the best fit for the learning goal that I'm working on. So let's take a look at what this teacher came up with. This teacher attached a link to the deeper level thinking task that he or she created, and it looks like it's being presented to the students in Google Slides form. It doesn't have to be. It can be on a Google Doc or anything else, but you need to create what you would actually put in front of students for the deeper level thinking task. So this teacher is going to remind them of the learning goal. They need to be able to demonstrate an understanding of multiplication or division word problems, but to make sure that it's at a depth of 3, the problem needs to engage them in decision making, problem solving, with the possibility of more than one possible answer, as well as justifying why they went about it the way that they did. So the teacher provides a word problem, but notice how the teacher here asks the students to show evidence of each of the steps. For example, demonstrating an understanding of the problem itself, application of the skills that have been taught, developing the equation, solving the equation, and then labeling and hopefully explaining the answer as well. But just like before, we know that there are certain students in our class that are going to struggle with this particular task. So again, I'd look very, very closely at each of my kiddos and then list each and every single one of them out and identify what they're likely to struggle with and how I'm going to accommodate them to help them be successful without reducing the challenge of the task itself. So I'd go back to that list of suggested accommodations and modifications and pick the one that's the best fit to the student and to the task. So I'll know that I'm done when I have a link to the deeper level assessment I'll put in front of kiddos and a list of all my most struggling students and how I'll support them. Now in the final section of Midterm Part 2, I need to make sure that I develop success criteria to help evaluate each and every student's performance on the deeper level thinking task. So this success criteria needs to align very closely with the deeper level thinking task that's been designed. So in this case, this teacher put the learning goal up at the top, labeled the task, and then came up with 3 different levels of performance. Meets the criteria, exceeds the criteria, and does not meet the criteria. And he or she is evaluating their students' ability to demonstrate an understanding of the problem, planning out a solution, then getting an answer. Now, it's very important that the categories that you're evaluating your students come right from your learning goal and aren't just add-ons that you think are important. For example, we might think that it's important for students to write neatly, but that's not something we should evaluate them on in this case because it has nothing to do with the learning goal. So, in summary, make sure that you look very closely at the group of students that you're working with, and then develop a formative assessment for your students, for you to administer to your students. You identify the accommodations that you will implement to help them be successful, a rubric or action plan to help you make instructional decisions based on how your students do on the formative assessment, and a deeper level thinking task that would be administered at the end of the lesson with an accompanying success criteria. And don't forget that you need to accommodate your students on the deeper level thinking task like you did for the formative assessment. But please don't just list the exact same accommodations here on the formative assessment that you do on the deeper level thinking task or assessment. Yes, you'd be helping the same kids, but different tasks often require different support strategies. If you get stuck or overwhelmed, don't forget to click and see the example that's been provided to you.